Now, the good news is that he didn't just die, but that he rose from the dead. A lot of good guys have died, but only one that I know of has risen from the dead. And then he didn't just appear to a few, but he appeared to 500. You're going to hear me say that a lot tonight because I can't drive that point home enough. 500 eyewitnesses, many of whom were still alive that day and easily could have validated or torn apart the whole case for Christ. With that in mind, let's build a case and see where the evidence leads. Now, the case for the resurrection is pretty straightforward. I told you the significance is that it's the very hinge of Christianity. Now, the evidence surrounding the resurrection is this. These are the historical facts for the pre-resurrection. That Jesus Christ was flogged publicly. He was carried around Jerusalem where everybody saw where the the crucifixion was about to take place. He was dragged up the hillside and crucified publicly. Then, as he was thought for dead, instead of having his legs broken, they pierced him in the side with a spear. And they got him in the pericardium, which is the sac around the heart. And water and blood poured forth. They then took him down from the cross and wrapped him in 75 pounds of linen. Put him in a tomb with a big old rock in front of it, sealed it with a Roman seal, suggesting that if you mess with this, you'll end up like this guy did on a cross, and then put a Roman guard in front of it. Guard meaning plural, guards. This is the pre-resurrection facts. Now, the post-resurrection facts are just as impressive because we have Mary Magdalene, a second-rate citizen with a very questionable background, as the primary witness who first saw Christ raised from the dead. Why would anybody list someone with such a questionable background who's a second-rate citizen as your primary witness unless she was? And then he started appearing to the disciples who ran away for their lives in fear. And all of a sudden they found courage. And then the Roman guards said they fell asleep, and the religious leaders of the days said that they believed the disciples had stolen the body. Why? Because the tomb was empty. And then, all of a sudden, hundreds of people in this city who had seen Jesus dragged around and dripping blood all over their streets, crucified, claimed to have seen him risen. Some had touched him, some had eaten with him. Many had seen him. These are the historical facts that surround the eyewitness testimonies to this event. Now, what do we do with the tomb? It's either occupied or empty. If it's occupied, skeptics suggest that it was the wrong tomb. I would challenge that, and that if it was, why didn't the Romans or the religious leaders of that day go to the right tomb and quickly squelch this insurrection and this confusion that was beginning to rise up in the community? Secondly, people thought it was a spiritual resurrection. The people just feel like he raised from the dead, but he really didn't. If this is the case, then how do we account for the fact that people touched him, saw him, and ate with him? A ghost can't eat. Thirdly, what do we do with the claims that Jesus really wasn't crucified, that it was somebody else, a twin? Well, this undermines the eyewitness accounts that say that it was in fact Christ who was crucified. These claims don't come till hundreds of years later, and the biggest one comes 600 years later by another religious leader. And really, it sounds more like a conspiracy theory than fact, because it doesn't line up with the eyewitness testimonies that we have, both inside the Bible and out. So, where does this lead us? Well, it leads us to the fact that the tomb was most likely empty. And therefore, the skeptics offer three suggestions to why the tomb was empty. Number one is that friends stole the body. Or number two, enemies stole the body. Well, the question with this lies with motive. What's the motive to stealing the body? The answer is, there is none. The disciples, 10 of the 11 faithful disciples, died as martyrs. For a lie? Give up your career, your family, and die a terribly painful and torturous death for a lie? It doesn't make sense. These weren't religious leaders. These were carpenters, fishermen, tax collectors. They said, we did not come up with cleverly devised tales, but we tell you what we saw and heard with our own eyes. So it doesn't make any sense that these men who ran away as cowards would come back so courageous unless they in fact had seen the risen Lord. And enemies or thieves don't make any sense either, because there's no motive. Why steal a body and risk getting thrown on the cross yourself? And how do you get through a Roman guard at that? So the third skeptical point is the swoon theory, that Jesus really didn't die. As a matter of fact, he felt a cool breeze in the tomb and was resuscitated. Well, you don't have to be a medical major to know that when your pericardium or heart is pierced and you have a hole in your heart and no blood left, that it's hard to live. Less alone, get up out of 75 pounds of linen that you've been wrapped in, that the guy somehow missed you were really alive, get out of the tomb naked by moving probably a 1,000-pound stone on your own, slip by the guards, and then appear to a few hundred people and tell them, hey, I've risen, and pass out. Not a very convincing story at all. So what does this suggest? Well, the explanations of the appearances is that maybe the witnesses lied, that they really didn't see Christ. Again, the question here is, what's the motive? And how do you account for somebody like James, the brother of Jesus, half-brother of Jesus, who did not believe he was the Messiah pre-resurrection, all of a sudden believe that he was in fact the Messiah? And then James, who now believes that Christ is in fact the Messiah, leads the Jerusalem church in the hometown where these events took place. And how do you account for Paul, who is the greatest persecutor of the church, who claims to have seen the risen Christ? And all of a sudden he comes back as the greatest proponent for the church, apart from the resurrection. You can't. As a matter of fact, if you dismiss the historical validity of the resurrection, the historical proof and the burden of proof lies on you, because you raise far more questions than you can answer by accepting where the evidence is leading is that he rose from the dead. And then we have hallucinations, that people just thought they saw Jesus resurrected. Well, that doesn't make sense. When the last time you asked your roommate, hey, how's that dream last night? Wasn't that awesome? You don't share dreams with people. You don't share visions with people. They're personal. And so how do all these people just have the same vision? They don't. That's craziness. And last but not least is its legend. Well, again, compelling case with 500 witnesses, plus the fact that the church starts in the very city where this took place, where it easily could have been disproved. The church's primary doctrines hinge on communion and baptism, which would have no meaning apart from the fact that Christ rose from the dead. It'd be like reliving the most horrific death you could ever imagine over and over and over again. But that's not the case. The fact of the matter is that he rose from the dead. And every time they baptized or had communion, they did this in remembrance of him overcoming death and conquering sin. These propel me to believe, as Sir Lionel Luku, that Christ in fact did raise from the dead. And that is the most logical verdict. Now, I told you that the resurrection is about far more than facts and figures. It's about our hope. And I told you it's a story between tragedy and hope. Tragedy in that if Christ didn't raise from the dead, then death wins. Hope that if Christ did raise from the dead, then there's hope for all of us that we too will rise who've placed our faith in him.